Hello and welcome back. In this video I'm going to demonstrate a technique where we can completely reverse the lighting in a photograph and still end up with a believable result, and more importantly still retain detail in those all-important highlight areas and stop them blowing out. This is our finished result, and this is what we started with. So you can see that there's a massive difference in the lighting, and we'll step through this one step at a time. Now, the first thing to remember is you can't recover highlight detail in images where it's already blown out. So let's firstly have a look at the raw file that was processed in Lightroom, and I'll just drag that over now and we'll have a look at the settings to demonstrate that it was not in fact blown out. Here's our image in Lightroom with the developed settings, and you can see here that there is no blown out highlights. We have some highlight areas here, but we've made adjustments to make sure that they are not blown out. So let's get rid of that and let's start to have a look at the rest of the work that we've done to the image. So let's go all the way back down to the beginning and start with our raw file as opened in Photoshop. And the first technique we're going to demonstrate is what we call reattaching the highlights, and it's this area here that we're wanting to pick up the detail in, because even though it's not blown out, it is pretty close to being blown out. And what we do here is we do a few steps to maintain that highlight detail. First thing we need to do is we need to go to the select tool, and we go into the somewhat confusingly named color range option, and here we're going to select not only a color range, but we're going to select the highlight parts of the image. And when we choose highlights in this tool, we've got a couple of tools. We've got the fuzziness tool and we've got the range. And all we're really worried about is picking up the absolute brightest parts of the image, which are the feathers on the shag and some of that highlighted areas in the rocks. And we can adjust that by adjusting the range and then the fuzziness. The fuzziness determines how much is included in that range, what tones around that. That looks pretty good to me, so we'll make a selection of that. And of course we can't see that selection because it's not on the base image. And now we can see the selection, the feathers on the bird and some of the rocks. The next thing we need to do is to go back to our select tools, and we need to modify that, and we need to feather that selection, not by 360 pixels, but let's say by about 5 pixels, so that we've got now a slightly softer selection. With that selection active, we go and create a curves adjustment layer, and the secret to this adjustment layer is we don't make any adjustment to the curve itself. We merely change the blending mode to multiply. And let's have a look at it here. Here's my curves adjustment. Here's my mask or my selection. If I hold down the Alt key, click on the mask, you'll see here that I've got this selection identified. And in fact, what we might want to do is even feather that a little bit more, and we can use the feathering option in the Properties tab to soften that even more. So let's just go back, Alt click again, and let's zoom in and see what we've done. You can see here that we've actually brought back some detail into those highlight areas and also in the rock. And we've got a slightly dark edge there, so we should just bring back that feathering a little bit so that we're not introducing any unwanted halos. So that's the first step, and this works beautifully on any image where you have highlight areas that are on the verge of blowing out and you don't want to see them blow out once you start doing other adjustments to the image. Now, all of the next steps that we are going to carry out with this image rely on us having an accurate selection of the bird and the rock. And to do this, there are a number of ways to do it. One of the easiest ways might be to go to the select tool and come down and say, maybe we can select the subject. And Photoshop has a pretty good tool built in, and you can see here that it's done a fairly good job of selecting our bird, but hasn't quite included all the bits we want. And so with that selection active, we would then go and pick up the quick selection tool, making sure that we have the plus selection marked on here, and then we could just simply move over the rocks to pick up the rest of that detail, and of course it will pick up those areas. And just one thing to remember when you're making a selection, always make sure that you're working on an image layer. You can't make a selection on a curves or any other layer. So with that selection active, we're most of the way there, but of course we've got some issues. We haven't picked up that fine detail around the head and some of these other feathers. So once you've made your initial selection, you need to go into the select and mask options, and with the refine brush tool you can then paint in around the edges to refine that edge. But with the latest version of Photoshop, you've also got the option to refine hair, and when we talk about refining hair, we're also talking about feathers. It works really well on feathers and other areas where there are fine details. But of course it won't be perfect, and we will probably need to come around here and paint around the edges. Now I always tick the Smart Radius button, and then I follow around the edges where the feathers need to be picked up in a little more detail. And you may need to go backwards and forwards on this a few times to ensure that your selection is really good. And the essence of this technique is to make a really good selection. Don't worry if you've got a few darker areas here. We can rectify that by tweaking a few of the settings. We've broadly got the settings where we want, but you can see there's a bit of fuzziness around the feathers here. We can fix this by tweaking the contrast settings, and you'll find that that's going to get you pretty close, but then you've missed a couple of areas, and so we can go backwards and forwards a couple of times to just refine those little areas that Photoshop might have missed. But I'm not going to bore you with the detail of going backwards and forwards with this, but once you get pretty close, go back in, select and mask, and you can adjust the radius of this by going a little bit finer, and it will pick up some more finer detail. But the essence is spend a little bit of time doing this and you'll get it right. That's okay now. What I'll do is I'll deselect that now because I made a selection earlier and saved it, which you should also do when you've made a complex selection. Always save that selection. I've called it the shag and the rock for obvious reasons, and here's my selection. And that the marching ants on the image don't always show you the full story because it's not showing all of those little fine areas that we refined, but that doesn't matter. With that selection active, what we'll firstly do, and we'll come up here and we'll ignore the layers that I've already created. What we want to do firstly is darken down the background, but we've got a selection of the bird and the rock. So the first thing I need to do now is go to my select tool and go and invert that selection so that instead of having the bird and the rock selected, I now have everything else. With that selected, I will go up to another curves adjustment layer, and this time I'm going to just pull down the highlight areas, the top part of the curve, to darken everything down, and if I really want to, I can darken things down. Now, one thing to remember when you start using curves adjustments in Photoshop or any image adjustment program, once you start playing with curves, you'll see that as you adjust things, colors get vastly more saturated. So you need to just be careful with how much you adjust, and we can alleviate those problems a little bit later. So here's our first step. We'll darken down the background. And of course, the next step might be we want to lighten the bird. So we have that selection of the bird available. Let's go back in and load that selection again. Because we saved it, we can always come back and load that selection. This time we've got the bird selection, and I'm going to just delete these other versions of the image because it's going to confuse you. We're now going to create another curves adjustment, this time with the bird selected, and this time we're going to lighten the foreground. Now just be careful, you go too far it looks way unbelievable. Just lighten it enough so that you get the overall brightness looking somewhere where it needs to be. This is the version I made earlier, and again if we hold down Alt and click on the mask, you can see that my mask is pretty detailed. and I have gone in and I've painted out a few areas where I decided I didn't want to start lightening too much. For instance, I didn't want to start lightening that part of the rock, so I just simply painted on that version of the mask. So we're getting somewhere close to what we want now, but there's still a little bit of a problem. The head of the bird is not as bright as it ought to be. So let's go back in and let's have a look at what we've done now. I've made another curves adjustment where I've done some selective lightening, and what I've done is I've just made a mask filled with black and then painted on with my brush tool and the white color at low opacity to then build up the lightness in the areas where I wanted to just lighten that a little more. So if I turn that off and on, you can see that I've filled in some of those areas where the light just wasn't getting, and by keeping it fairly low opacity I can then bring it up little by little until I achieve the result I want. So here we've filled in a few more areas and just put a little bit more light overall on the bird. And I decided that that little bit of the beak needed a little bit more color, so I've done a selective hue and saturation adjustment, and you'll see if I come down to the, I think it's the yellow channel, I've increased the saturation on the yellow channel, but I've made a mask and I've just painted in around his beak because I didn't want to increase the color in that background area. Now moving on from here, I decided that I still wanted to adjust the tonality a little more, so I've used the inverse overlay technique that I've demonstrated in a previous video. I won't step through that again, but I've used that to just bring a little bit more light into the foreground here, and again I've put a mask on this and just painted in just the areas I wanted, and that really starts to make the bird stand out. And to add a little bit more detail into the feathers of the bird, because now that we've lightened him up a bit, there's a bit of detail lacking in the feathers. So a technique that I use an awful lot is to make a composite layer and go into Nik Silver Effects and apply one of the filters there, which would be High Structure Smooth or High Structure Smooth, and again using my mask from the selection that I saved, apply that and blend it to luminosity so we don't lose our color information, and you can see here that it brings out a lot of that fine detail in the feathers, and that makes a massive difference. You can see the difference there. And then when I'm getting pretty close now, the next thing I did was I went again into Nik, into Color Effects Pro, and used a tonal contrast adjustment, and that again put a bit more detail into those areas, but it introduced a little bit of a blue cast, which I didn't want. So my next step was to add a hue and saturation adjustment, and I used my mask again that I'd saved and reused to remove color from the background, and then finally another hue saturation adjustment, this time just targeting the bird, and what I did there was just took out some of the blues. You'll see here, took the blue saturation almost completely out because there was a blue reflection from the sky coming into this part of the feathers, and I didn't really want that, and so I removed that. And then my final step is to just put a slight vignette on the image. And a lot of people get confused about putting vignettes on an image, so I'll demonstrate how we do that as our last step. Now the last thing I'm going to demonstrate is how to put a very simple vignette on your image. Now of course you can put a vignette on in Lightroom in your initial processing steps, but it relies on making an equally distant vignette from all edges, and often we don't want to do that. In this case we really want to just highlight our bird, and I'm going to show you how to do this quite simply with a few steps. Firstly, we're going to need to select our lasso tool and draw a very rough line around our bird, and it doesn't even need to be particularly precise because we're going to soften this by feathering it. So there's our selection. The next thing we need to do is go to our select menu and we'll go down to modify and feather, and in this instance we want to feather it by 360 pixels, which is a very large amount, and you'll see then that my slightly rough line has now smoothed out. And we've got now a selection of the bird, and what we want to do is we want to reverse that because we want to feather the selection and show it on the background. So we just go and invert that. So now we have our selection 100% at the edges and fading through this zone at 360 pixels. So we've got our selection made and feathered. What we do now is we go back to another curves adjustment layer, and what we do is just drag down that white point slightly and pull the middle part of the curve down, and that creates a very subtle and effective vignette. And the idea is with a vignette around your image is not to make it too obvious. If you really pull it down darkly, that looks way too obvious, and then you start to have the problem of color saturation coming back in. So we just want to keep it fairly subtle, and that's the simple way to do that. I hope you found this video helpful. I look forward to seeing you again soon.